first of all, when targeting started, it was going to change. It was going to change from blanket food assistance because all the refugees in the Rwanda operation were under blanket assistance, and we have 6 refugee camps in the country because, as you know, Rwanda is a small country. So we have 6 refugee camps. 5 of them are hosting refugees from the DRC, and 1 is hosting refugees from Burundi, who are the majority. So targeting came in as a commitment from a joint commitment, UNHCR, WFP, and also government commitment, because they needed to weather off the refugees from blanket assistance into self-reliance in order to also reduce the dependency and try to promote self-reliance. And it was also brought up because of limited funding resources from WFP. So the commitment of WFP and UNHCR jointly was also while the consultation with the community was considered, is because the whole process was initiated to go through they wanted the beneficiaries or the persons of concern to go through the whole process of targeting. That's why we had also consultation with the communities. Next slide, Emmanuel. For the next slide, my internet is a bit slow, but I think for the next slide, the findings, yes, the findings of the consultations. So like I mentioned, we have 6 refugee camps, and the consultation was conducted in March 2021. Manuel, maybe you could go back to the previous slide, because yes, thank you. Yes, so 41 consultation sessions were held throughout the 6 camps. In all the 6 camps, and this involved 200 participants. And like Michael mentioned and Sylvia previously, we had different focus group discussions for the refugee women and also different for the refugee men. And we also had key informant interviews. But for the key informant interviews, we are also able to involve residents from the host community. So for the focus group discussions, these were basically refugees, but for the key informants, we are able to involve the residents from the host community. So in total, we had 41 consultations in all the sessions that we had. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. So there were key findings, which were also a bit similar to the ones in Cameroon. For the protection risks, we had findings from the community level and also for the household level. So for the community level, the participants were worried that this would increase crime because it was a first-time program, and they were worried that if people would be moved from the target assistance, they were worried that people would resort to crime from those who are benefiting from the target, from the assistance. And also, it also took place when we were doing a repatriation of the Burundian refugees back. So the participants were worried that if some individuals were not included in the targeting, this would target off requests for or involvement into the repatriation process without consideration of the situation back in the host community. So they also mentioned there would be tension between the camp and the host community because those that were not included in the targeted assistance would resort to crime or stealing from the host community. So they say this would increase tension between the host and the camp communities. They also thought there would be some unrest and demonstrations because this was a first-time project. Because initially everybody was receiving blanket assistance, so they were worried that people would resist the change being a first-time change, and this would lead to unrest and demonstration. They also mentioned theft from the host community, like I had mentioned, and also tension within the humanitarian workers, because they were worried that people wouldn't understand the targeting process at the same level, or they would be scrambling for resources. They worried that the targeting might limit their resource, so they were worried about the tension from the implementing partners and the humanitarian workers on the field. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. So at the household level, the participants mentioned that there would be stress, definitely for those that were not included into assistance. There would be stress, which maybe would even lead to suicidal or depression for the families that were worried about where to get assistance for their families. So this would increase the tension, stress raised. Also school dropouts, because they worried that if the families were not able to feed the children will not be able to go to school on hungry stomachs. So this was something raised from the participants. They also mentioned the risk among the youth. And they also mentioned that the youth would resort to high-risk coping strategies, including survival sets, drug use, crime, because there were already some particular young adults or youths were not considered for targeting. They would resort to other coping mechanism, and also survival sex, especially for the single female headed household who would not meet the eligibility criteria and would not be included in food assistance. They were worried that they would resort to survival sex in order to find an option for food assistance. They were also worried about family conflict. If there was misunderstanding of managing the limited resources that they would now have, they thought there would be a family conflict, domestic violence, other issues. Also malnutrition, because they thought the families would not be able to provide for their children, leading to malnutrition and not providing a full diet or food for their children. And also child protection issues, including neglect, abandonment of the children while the parents went to look for other ways of surviving. So these were some of the issues raised by the participants at the household level. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. I think this was similar to what Sylvia's shared in the Cameroon context. When the participants were asked which preferred channels they preferred for information sharing, they mentioned the mass meetings where all the refugees were called upon, targeting information shared, and they would have time for question and answer. So they say this was the most practical way of passing the information. They also talked about community representatives, because they have the executive committees, village leaders, until the grassroots level. So they thought this would be also a channel of passing the information. Megaphone, loudspeaker, sound system, because during COVID now and mass gathering is limited, they preferred mobile cars to move around with the loudspeakers and megaphones passing on the messages. They also proposed pamphlets and leaflets at the household level that will be distributed in a language they understand, so that information would also be disseminated. They also mentioned the staff, presence of field staff, both WFP, UNHCR, and also the partners. They also said it would be easy to consult with the staff to get information. But the challenges raised were COVID-19 regulations, because mass gathering was not allowed. They also mentioned that people with disabilities would not easily access information, because it was hard to reach them at the household level. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. And then when asked about how they would receive feedback from the complaints or questions, they mentioned UNHCR and WFP help desks, because UNHCR and WFP staff are present in the field and they've put up desks. So they mentioned that they'll be able to consult them or reach out to them to get feedback. They also mentioned we have UNHCR and WFP have hotlines in the camp that receive complaints or any other issues the refugees can call through. They also mentioned a suggestion box that are placed within the camps. But they had also challenges where they said there will be delayed response in getting feedback. Then also the presence of field staff, because during COVID-19 there's a restriction where 30% of the field staff were requested to be present, and some camps were under total lockdown. So they were saying this would be a challenge in getting feedback or raising complaints. They also mentioned that all staff needed to be trained, not only those involved in targeting, but even in other services, so that whoever refugee or person of concern would approach would be able to give a specific feedback with regards to targeting. And also the hotlines were not actually toll-free, so calling in would also be an expense. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. And then, yeah, lastly, these are some of the challenges and lessons learned from the Rwanda operation. But for the challenges, these were also similar with the Cameroon, the COVID restriction, I also mentioned the potential resistance from the refugees, because this was the first time change from blanket assistance to targeted assistance. It was also conducted in a limited timeline. The refugees were saying they needed more time to consult a bigger population than what the 200 participants that we had consulted. So they felt they needed more time to make more consultations and assessment. And then also staff capacity, because for targeting, we needed to recruit new staff to physically deal with targeting, because other staff had a lot of priorities and other competing jobs. And then level of illiteracy, especially with regards to the explaining the criteria for targeting, and then limited livelihood opportunities. There are livelihood opportunities, but not all the refugees can access them. So they also complained that we started targeting, but we had to increase the opportunities, livelihood opportunities available. So for the lessons learned, before I conclude, what we learned that for this specific consultation with the communities, enough time needed to be allocated so that the refugees would understand and also provide feedback. And then also for UNHCR registration database where the criteria are filtered through, it also needed to be updated on a regular basis with specific needs updated in progress, then also livelihood opportunities, education. These needed to be updated regularly so that once the lists, assistant lists are filtered out, they can be able to capture all the criteria so that we don't have the exclusion gap. And then also it was very important to have government commitment, because government pushed for this to start rolling off, and also helped reach out to the persons of concern and explain why this was happening. So also it's also good to have a strategy of mobilization and information sharing before the rollout of the whole program. So in brief, I think that's most of the findings from the Rwanda operation. Thank you very much. Over.